So, Mr. Rasmussen, we just, following what's happening now in particular, and looking for ahead of the U.S. elections, we heard there are people supporting Donald Trump, and the things they are telling about the support of the participation of the U.S. participation of NATO are really disturbing for people in Europe. So, what is your concern, and is it serious?
It is a very serious concern. Recently, Mr. Trump raised doubts about collective security within NATO. He raised doubts that America and that NATO would help a NATO ally that would be attacked by Russia. And this is undermining the credibility of our alliance. So it's very serious.
And what would be the answer of the NATO? Or the people just following and watching what the people in the U.S. whom they would vote for?
Yeah.
But in case of, be prepared.
Yeah, of course we can't vote, but we can raise our voice, and that's exactly what I'm doing. In due time before the election, I want to make sure that the American electorate understands what is at stake. And what is at stake is the American leadership of the world. For me, it's not a question about a Republican or a Democrat in the White House. It's a question about the will to lead. And we need America as the world's policeman. If America is perceived to retreat from the world, they will leave behind a vacuum. And that vacuum will be filled by the bad guys.
You raised, with the discussion with Mr. Gingrich, you raised the issue of support for the Baltic states. But that's what Mr. Gingrich said. But somehow from the NATO allies, we also do not see that unity, even regarding in the Warsaw Summit elsewhere. In fact, we have this brigade permanent rotation. But still, why it doesn't feel that the NATO is as united?
Actually, it is united. I think we have achieved to maintain the unity. Of course, you will always, in a democratic alliance, you will always have some discussions. Of course you will. But I am pretty sure that if Russia were to attack, for instance, one of the Baltic states, other NATO allies would help that state. And a concrete example is our decision to establish what we call a rapid reaction force, which is a military force, a NATO force, that can be deployed very fast to any ally that would be attacked.
For the Ukrainians currently, not very easy to understand what exactly NATO support towards Ukraine means. There was expected, really tough actions when the Crimean annexation started. Of course, there is communication, there are a lot of talks, conferences, discussion, training of the Ukrainian military. But 2 years and a half, it didn't look like there is a clear, result. Maybe the part of that is the way how Ukraine reforms itself and the Ukrainian army. But what you would answer that in NATO support is not so obvious. It still looks like the NATO acted in a weak way compared to what Russia had done, breaking the world order.
Yeah, but first of all, I have to stress, of course, there is a difference between being a member of NATO and not being a member of NATO. And Ukraine is not a member of NATO, which means NATO has no obligation vis-à-vis Ukraine. But having said that, I think it's essential that NATO strengthen its cooperation with and support for Ukraine.
What does it mean?
Yeah, it means, in concrete terms, it means, I think, if Russia continues to destabilize the situation in eastern Ukraine, I think NATO allies should consider delivering lethal defensive weapons to Ukraine so that the Ukrainian army improves its capability to defend itself.
What's your point on the Minsk process, in particular within this day? It doesn't work if there is no closure of the border, from military point of view, from any point of view. There would be those who would say it's a stalemate. It's not moving anywhere.
No, but that's because of the Russians, as you mentioned. Ultimately, we should restore full Ukrainian control with the eastern border. As long as that is not the case, I understand very well the reluctance among Ukrainian politicians to move forward on their side. Let me remind you that the Ukrainian parliament has already approved the amendments of the constitution in their first reading. To achieve a final approval, they need a second reading, but obviously they will not proceed until the Russians had delivered their part of the Minsk agreement.
And today, NATO still looks like being the unity of, let's say, the richest countries, the most developed countries. It's still, compared to Russia, looks reactive. Rather like answering to what Russia has done and never inventing something new.
Yeah, of course, we do not want a military confrontation with Russia. But I think we should prolong the sanctions against Russia. I do not think Russia has fulfilled conditions for a lifting or moderation of the sanctions. And I would add to this, I think the European Union should prolong sanctions for a period of 12 months, not only 6 months as we used to do it, because a 12-month prolongation would harmonize the European efforts and the American efforts, and we would avoid mixing sanctions up with elections, not only in the US, but also in Germany and France. So for these reasons, I think we should strengthen sanctions through a prolongation of 12 months instead of 6 months.
If you speak about the reforming Ukraine and its cooperation to NATO, what are like 1-2 top priorities? If you speak about the current stage, because I know you're also advising Ukraine on that. So what are your key recommendations to things to change?
On reforms?
On the reforms, and on the reforms in particular of the military sector.
Oh yeah, but I would say overall the most important reform is the fight against corruption all over society, in the military as well as in all other sectors. This is the main priority for all European countries, that Ukraine steps up her fight against corruption. So that's the most important reform. As regards the military, I would say a very important change that would be very much appreciated in Western capitals would be to put the Ukrainian military under civilian control. Ukraine has already agreed to do it, so it's more a question of the timetable. And I would say the faster Ukraine could do it, the better.
What we listen now about the threats of the future, it's a lot about the cybersecurity. We hear the people like even the US candidate emails had been hacked, and it happens all over the place. And it also doesn't feel that there is a real response, so what you would say as a former NATO official and somebody from this?
Clearly, we have responded already, but it's a continuous fight against cyber attacks. We have agreed within NATO on a very comprehensive action plan that involves the NATO systems. We have continuous attacks against the NATO systems, but so far we have maintained secure systems. They have not been compromised. We have also decided to establish a very rapid action team which can be deployed in individual member states if they so request. For instance, if a member state is cyber attacked, then NATO can deploy some experts to help them defend themselves.
There is still more or less the biggest debate regarding the Ukraine, NATO, being a participant of NATO, is always, do you provoke Russia with having new members or you don't. Some people, but there would be those who say that not doing something, being kind of being afraid to provoke is exactly the provocation. What is your view on that?
My view is very clear. It's not for Russia to decide who should become members of NATO in the future. And let me remind you that already in 2008, NATO decided that Ukraine will become a member of NATO once in the future. Once Ukraine fulfills the necessary criteria, Ukraine will become a member of NATO. That's a clear decision. That decision still stands. And Russia cannot interfere with that decision. Of course, one of the conditions that must be fulfilled is that once Ukraine enters NATO, Ukraine should contribute to the overall Euro-Atlantic security, of course. And that's what we are working hard to fulfill those criteria.
Finally, it was during your time of being a Secretary General when also the ISIS more or less appeared. It was a different organization, it has its roots. But the big question is, the West has so much, intellectually, with the funds what the US have, and how it happened that they can't really compete with more or less the group of the extremists, which do not have this super high-level technologies, that much money as a NATO. Why the West is failing to really to do that kind of things? If we speak about fighting ISIS.
Yeah. First of all, what you are witnessing now is what we call asymmetrical warfare. You can, in a very cheap way, you can initiate attacks against the most sophisticated armies in the world. That's actually what you are seeing. Now, you ask me why could that happen? Personally, I think the West should have supported the moderate opposition in Syria much earlier. But finally, the West decided to initiate an air campaign against ISIS. I think we will succeed in a combination between this air campaign and ground troops from the Kurds and others. I think ISIS will be dissolved more or less. So far, so good. But to prevent terrorism in the future, we need to get rid of all the autocratic systems in the Middle East. Not only in Syria, but also in other countries. People want freedom, they want democracy.
Finally, within your time, have you a chance to talk to Mr. Putin?
Oh yes, indeed, I've met.
And what is your impression? How you deal with it?
Yeah, but he started out being a very pro-Western, pro-European president. I met him first time in May 2002. At that time, he was very pro-Western. I met him on several occasions, and gradually he became more and more negative. Why? Yes, because of the colored revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine. He thought that these revolutions were instigated by the Americans in general and CIA in particular. And from 2005, we saw a still more negative Putin. So I have met him on several occasions and also seen this development. I have to say, basically, I'm in favor of a constructive cooperation between Russia and the West. I do believe that we share interests. If Russia is threatened, it's definitely not from the West. It's from the South. It's from Islamistic forces in Caucasus. But in the attack on Ukraine in 2014, we saw that the Russians do not share our vision. And since then, I have really been tough both in action and in words, against the Russians and against Putin, because I do believe that a firm stand from our side is the best way to convince him and convince the Russians that they should cooperate.